We begin the day with another chapter in the Ukraine-Russia standoff. Representatives from both countries met in person today, together with their German and French counterparts in Paris. The four-way Normandy format has been used repeatedly since Russia's annexation of Ukraine's Crimean peninsula in 2014. Also tonight, Washington has delivered its written response to Russia's security demands. We don't know the exact details of this letter, but we do know that the U.S. and its allies have not budged on some demands, like keeping the door open to NATO membership for Ukraine. The letter is the latest step in the ongoing diplomacy over fears of a Russian invasion. Here's what the U.S. Secretary of State had to say.
Today, Ambassador Sullivan delivered our written response in Moscow. All told, it sets out a serious diplomatic path forward, should Russia choose it. The document we've delivered includes concerns of the United States and our allies and partners about Russia's actions that undermine security, a principled and pragmatic evaluation of the concerns that Russia has raised, and our own proposals for areas where we may be able to find common ground. I expect to speak to Foreign Minister Lavrov in the coming days after Moscow has had a chance to read the paper and is ready to discuss next steps. We make clear that there are core principles that we are committed to uphold and defend, including Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and the right of states to choose their own security arrangements and alliances.
Russia's foreign minister also spoke today and criticized Western countries for taking an aggressive stance against Moscow. Here's what Sergei Lavrov had to say.
Without exaggerating, our Western colleagues are in some kind of military frenzy. They only talk about one thing. We will punish you, you will attack. We will punish you and save Ukraine. It won't be pretty. The West is using all these hysterical statements to make their position clear. We are ready for any developments. We did not attack anyone. We have been attacked before, and those who did it got what they deserved every time. Therefore, I will not speculate about our Western partners. They are weak and apparently do not really know how to get out of the impasse into which they have got themselves.
As we mentioned, this all comes as high-ranking officials from Ukraine and Russia met face-to-face along with their counterparts in France and Germany to hold negotiations in the Normandy format. And DW correspondent Christine Mundwa has been following those talks for us. Hi, Christine. How much does what we just heard from both Antony Blinken and Sergei Lavrov there reflect what you have seen coming out of the negotiations?
Sumi, those talks in Paris, we're told, lasted some 8 hours. They were described as the Russian official as very difficult in nature. But it appears the remarks coming outside of that meeting are more conciliatory. There was a lot of talk about agreeing on certain issues. The bulk of those discussions were on the situation in the Donbas region, that is in eastern Ukraine, where I have to remind you, Sumi, that 15,000 people have been killed there since 2014, when a separatist conflict broke out. Now, the Russians, for their part, say they are not party to that conflict. But coming out of this meeting, the diplomat or the representatives from Moscow did say that Russia was willing to exert its influence on the separatists in the Donbas region. We're also told that they're going to be meeting again in about 2 weeks' time. And we believe that meeting could be taking place in Berlin and will potentially also be attended by the foreign ministers of the four respective countries.
Christine, we know that the West has also been discussing what their possible response would be in the case of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that would include a number of sanctions. So we heard U.S. President Joe Biden saying he would consider sanctioning Vladimir Putin personally, which Russia says would be politically destructive. How does Europe see this?
Well, we haven't heard a European leader say the very same thing. But I do want to point out the issue around what the European leaders are planning here. They are basically making plans for the event that there is an interruption of gas supply to the European Union from Russia. Europe depends on Russia for about a third of its gas supply. And it is feared that that supply could be interrupted either caused by the conflict or as a retaliation from Moscow. In fact, gas supply is seen as Mr. Putin's strongest economic a measure that he could retaliate with. So you are seeing a lot of plans being made with the help of Washington as well in terms of what could happen in the event that gas supply from Moscow to the European Union is interrupted, because it would make for a very cold winter here in Europe if that were to happen.
DW correspondent Christine Mundwa in Brussels there. Thank you. NATO has also sent a letter to the Russian government responding to the Kremlin's demands to the military alliance. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg repeated his assertion that a Russian invasion of Ukraine would come with severe costs. He called on Moscow to de-escalate the situation and admitted that the West and Russia are still far apart. But he also said diplomacy and not war would provide a solution to the crisis.
So we are now reaching out to Russia once again to try to pursue a path of dialogue and to find a political solution. We are also prepared for the worst. And therefore, in parallel with our efforts on the dialogue track, we are also increasing the readiness of our forces.
We can get some more perspective on this story now. Speaking to Richard Sakwa. He's a professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent and the author of the books Russia Against Arrest, The Post-Cold War Crisis of the World, and Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands. Mr. Sakwa, very good to have you with us on the day. I want to ask you, first of all, about what we've seen through the course of today, namely these written responses from Washington and from NATO to Moscow's security demands. I know that this is really just the latest step in the diplomatic process, but how do you think these will be received in Moscow?
Well, it depends what they say. We know that Washington asked Moscow not to make public their contents until there's been a chance to have diplomacy about them. So I think it's an important step forwards because it's engaging with Russian concerns. The degree to which they're going to have flexibility, we don't know, but it's certainly an important step towards possibly the de-escalation of the most immediate threat.
Okay, so an important step forward. Have you seen beyond that any signs of all of this diplomatic activity we've seen really over the last few weeks actually moving the needle in this standoff?
Well, it hasn't. In fact, the powers, Western powers, have been arming Ukraine. Don't forget, there's 100,000 Ukrainian, if not more, 100,000 Ukrainian troops on its own eastern border. And one of the reasons why Russia mobilized, and don't forget, this is the second time they've been doing it. The first time was April 2021, and a lot of the forces remained, was that Russia feared that Ukraine would do what happened to Nagorno-Karabakh, the Azerbaijani-Armenian war, last year. So it's the year before. So it's there's a military aspect to it, and there's a diplomatic aspect, and I think we should be really careful to separate the two.
I want to ask you a bit more about the military aspect of it, because it does seem to all parties involved very unlikely that Ukraine would join NATO anytime soon. So why would Vladimir Putin be making this step now? I'm asking really about the timing of this.
Yeah, there's two things about that. One of them is that the Ukrainian issue is part of a larger one, and that is the European Security Order that was established after the Cold War. And this is something that Putin's been concerned about, and before him Yeltsin and Gorbachev. That is NATO enlargement, and the fact that they argue not only was the promise not to enlarge NATO betrayed, but also that their view that security is indivisible, and that's one of the founding principles of the Paris Charter for a New Europe. So there's that larger issue, but why now? Putin is coming to the end of his term in 2024. He may come again, but certainly the idea was after 30 years, they really need to resolve the big issues, and obviously Ukraine is the front line of that.
If we look at the current situation right now on the ground, you have said that you are skeptical that an actual invasion is on the cards. At the same time, we see this Russian buildup of troops, 100,000, more than 100,000 troops, heavy missile systems, arsenal, armor as well. So what would that positioning be for, if not for an invasion?
Well, an invasion, the window for the invasion is closing because within about a month or a bit longer, you have what's called the Rasputitsa, which is the thaw. And so any heavy armor, which you mentioned, wouldn't, I mean, it could in modern equipment go, but it would be, we're talking about long-range missiles and aircraft and so on, if it comes to military action. But it's also the Beijing Winter Olympics starting in early February. And it's quite clear that Beijing has made it clear to Moscow it doesn't want any military action before then. And secondly, the Russian force posture isn't ready for any actual invasion. It really is saber-rattling. And this is where the analogy with the Cuban Missile Crisis does work. 60 years ago, Khrushchev, maybe foolishly, rashly, nevertheless, he got a certain element out of it, which is the removal of the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey, which is what started it all in the first place.
And I want to just follow up on that because you have called this a slow-burning Cuban Missile Crisis and a situation where both sides will have to find a way to allow the other to save face. What could that possibly look like at this point?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is diplomacy, and I think the first step in the Cuban Missile Crisis, so it's de-escalation, was not to keep saying that some things are non-negotiable. But the first issue is to stop the immediate crisis and then come to some second deal. How it could look like. One of the first things is that clearly NATO membership isn't, as you mentioned, on the cards for Ukraine, but perhaps some sort of long-term promise, 2 or 3 decades, to say Ukraine won't be joining NATO. And second, no other armed forces, military elements of alliance, to put what they now call in Ukraine a huge aircraft carrier parked next to Russia. And also the question of Ukrainian neutrality. Some people argue this is completely outrageous. But on the other hand, it was the official position of Ukraine until December 2014. So it's not that outrageous. And obviously Austria, Finland, Ireland have thrived within those conditions. So. Okay. The immediate thing is to try to keep the forces and stop it becoming military. And the second thing then is this, as it were, the outlines of a larger security deal for the whole continent.
We'll have to leave it there. Richard Sakwa, professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent. Thank you so much for joining us on the day.
My pleasure.
NATO and the United States have each delivered their response to Moscow's security demands amid tensions over Russian aggression towards its neighbor, Ukraine. At recent joint meetings, Moscow demanded a guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO and that the alliance would cease military activity in former Soviet republics. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Washington has set out a serious diplomatic path to resolve the conflict. He added that the U.S. made no concessions to the main demand on NATO membership for Kiev. And speaking a short time ago, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said it was time for both sides to improve dialogue and diplomacy by reestablishing their respective offices in Brussels and in Moscow. And here's more of what Stoltenberg had to say.
We call on Russia once again to immediately de-escalate the situation. NATO firmly believes that tensions and disagreements must be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy, not through force or the threat of force. So today, NATO has conveyed our written proposals to Russia. We have done so in parallel with the United States.
For more on the story, we can speak to Gustav Gressel. He's a security policy expert from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Hi, Gustav. Good to have you with us. We've heard there that Moscow has now received the written responses to its security demands, both from Washington and from NATO. Do you think this will move the needle at all in diplomatic progress?
Unfortunately, I don't think it will change much because Moscow's demands were written in a way that actually a rejection of them, or a polite rejection, as they might have gotten it now, was inevitable. And this was consciously chosen in Moscow to write it in a way that make the West and NATO reject it. The thing is, what happens thereafter? Will Moscow use this as a pretext for war? Or will some of the, as I said, polite rejections that said that over some concerns and issues there will be put path forwards to negotiate on them, will those be taken as honorable off-ramps to de-escalate the situation? That depends whether Russia takes the sanctions threat seriously. That depends whether Russia thinks that a war will cause it more trouble than it will gain from, given the increased support of European and the US nations to Ukraine, particularly in the military field. That remains to be seen. We don't know the decision on this yet.
Okay, so you say that this back and forth of these letters actually are not going to make much of a difference in terms of diplomacy and dialogue. You mentioned sanctions there and whether Moscow will take that threat seriously. And you have said that only very severe sanctions will have any effect on Vladimir Putin's decision-making. So what do you define as severe sanctions?
Look, Putin thinks that Russia can only survive the 21st century if it's an empire, not only by land force, but also by population and by governing over industrialized cities and centers, and that includes Ukraine. So he thinks that this is a very important strategic objective for Russia, and you will only scare him if you put up sanctions that would foil the plan for Russia being as strong and mighty and survivable in the 21st century as he wants it to be. And that means sectorial sanctions in the energy sector, one way or the other, and a large decoupling of the European and North American consumer market from Russia, because that undermines Russia's financial resources and its technological and societal bonds to that market and to European technology still as such, that Russia also perceives necessary for being sort of the kind of modernized great power that it wants to be. Other kind of diplomatic shamming, and even freezing Putin's personal assets, as important that is as a message, I don't think it will make him rethink what he's doing.
But hold on a minute, Gustav. Is it really that clear that Vladimir Putin is intent on invading Ukraine? Because there do seem to be real questions being asked about that here in Berlin and certainly in Brussels as well.
Yes, a lot of European countries think that the situation is not that serious. The problem, I mean, I'm a military expert. I'll look from it from a military point of view. And if I look at the formations, at the logistics, at the preparation, it's pretty serious. We also see other words than Russia usually uses when it leverages exercises or deployments to threaten or to bargain. The threats against Ukraine have been pretty consistent. The demands have been out there. And the willingness to use military force have been underlined by Putin himself, by Lavrov himself, with the same wording consistently over the last 3 months. So I think we should take that seriously.
Okay, very interesting. We'll have to leave it there. Gustav Gressel from the European Council on Foreign Relations, thanks for sharing your perspective with us today.
Thank you very much.